Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jamie Costa and I am the Gallery Experience Associate at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. We're excited to present today's program titled Conversation with the Artists in conjunction with our current online-only exhibition, Archive Machines. Today's program features 4 of the 44 artists featured in Archive Machines, whose works explore the ways in which archival structures and materials are interpreted, appropriated, and interrogated. These activations are framed in the exhibition by 4 sections titled Revisioning, Resisting, Rewiring, and Relating. And before I introduce the artists and we get started with their talks, I do have a few housekeeping bits. Please make sure your microphone is muted during the speaker's presentations. We'll have a few minutes toward the end of the program for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box and we will read them as they come in at that point in the program. And also as a reminder, this program is being recorded so that it can be made available on LMAG's website at a later date. And we are really happy to have 2 sign language interpreters here with us today to do the signing. With that, I'm happy to introduce our speakers for today's program. First, we have Sasha Bergstrom-Katz, who is an artist living between Los Angeles and London. Her work looks at how human sciences, particularly the psi disciplines, produce people as subjects and is specifically interested in how the subject is represented to itself through examination, study, and diagnosis. She is a current PhD candidate in psychosocial studies at Birkbeck University of London and holds an MFA from the University of California, Irvine. William Camargo is an arts educator, photo-based artist, and arts advocate born and raised in Anaheim, California. He is currently serving as Commissioner of Heritage and Archives, Commissioner of Heritage and Culture in the city of Anaheim. He is the founder and curator of Latinx Diaspora Archives, an archive Instagram page that elevates communities of color through family photos, and is a current artist in residence at the Latinx Project at NYU. He attained his MFA from Claremont Graduate University, a BFA at the California State University, Fullerton, and an AA from Fullerton College in photography. Boz Garden is a photographer, writer, and researcher studying the entanglements of Black, queer, and multi-species worlds that unmake our normative modes of relating to history, narration, the subject, and their geographies of violence. They are the editor for Fabulation Survey, a forthcoming press on environmental terror and resistance. They received their BFA in photo media from California Institute of the Arts. And last but not least, we have Rachel Zaretsky, who is a Los Angeles-based artist who uses performance, video, and photography to challenge our relationship to the creation of memories. Her inquiry-based art practice examines how modes of representation can portray absence, how we process loss, and how our desire to preserve through memorialization. Zaretsky holds a BFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York and is currently an MFA candidate at the University of Southern California. And in keeping with the order of the exhibition sections, first up is Rachel Zaretsky, whose work is included in the revisioning section.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us all here today to discuss the work in the show. I'll just wait a moment for the presentation before I jump in. So as Jamie just mentioned, I'm interested in our preoccupation with memorialization, both in small individual gestures and large-scale national commemorations. So the work included in this exhibition looks at a particular memorial, the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach. And I thought I'd begin by talking about an earlier work that kind of led me to this interest in the social life of memorial sites. If you could go to the next slide. Um, so I set out to photograph every crack at the memorial as a video I created after spending time in Berlin. This is a photo of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. It's a really large scale open-ended design. It's a field of these concrete stela varying in height. So some of them are low at your ankle and some tower over you. And when I was there, prior to going there, I studied it from afar. And when I had the chance to go to Berlin in 2016, I was really interested in making video work about this site. And I structured myself to sort of spend time there like it was my occupation. And my initial reaction to what happens at this memorial as a Jewish person was, I guess, surprise and frustration. If you could go to the next slide. But that also really led me to, I guess, ask questions about the performativity of memorial sites and also what do these sites do? Who are they for? There's so much conversation about the construction and relevance of symbols. And I guess I wanted to really hone in on what are the ways that they become animated and also what is their lifespan? You can go, thank you. So while I was there, I came to also understand that the size of the memorial and the lack of signage really contributes to create this space that functions more like a park. And I spent several hours a week on site interested in better understanding how people engage with this memorial through filming people there, photographing, writing, drawing, following people's paths within. And while there, I also noticed that every day it seemed like the stela were under construction and they always had cracks. And I did a little reading and I understood then that they were hollow due to cost and also the weight because there's actually an information center below ground. So one day with a camera, just trying to find some way to communicate this frustration with the lack of this site and what I was trying to comprehend, I photographed as many cracks as I could find before exhaustion. And then I made a slideshow style video that's about 10 minutes long. So I guess jumping ahead to the work in the exhibition, I'm still thinking about the same concepts around public remembrance, and I turned my attention to the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach, where I grew up and where I currently am for the month. Just to give some context, this memorial is in Miami Beach. The address is actually 1933 to 1945 Meridian Avenue. So the address is the duration of World War II. It's in a location where many Holocaust survivors lived over the years. And it also is in proximity to beaches, the hotels, nightlife, and also it's right across the street from the convention center where Art Basel takes place. It's also the first memorial I ever had a relationship to. So the memorial itself is a 40-foot oxidized arm with naked, emaciated figures crawling it up the arm. There's also a reflection pool and granite walls detailing information and commemorating the names of a number of those who have died in connection with the Miami community. And among those names are 17 family members of mine. So as an adult and living in Los Angeles, I haven't visited this site in a number of years. And at the time I was considering the next time I was in town to potentially go there to make a work about this site. Also, now that I had this new framework of understanding and thinking through memorials, but something struck me where I just sort of wondered if I needed to be there in order to have this conversation. And I went on Instagram and decided to look at the geotagged location of the memorial, and looking through there, I saw what gets created and uploaded there. I felt that this sort of contribution to the social space was very much like a living archive of the memorial. I also noticed that a lot of visitors engage with the sculpture in a figurative or engage with the sculpture's figurative quality, which I just found really fascinating. This memorial commemorates the victims of the Holocaust while also being located in this really touristic centric site, which kind of creates a spectrum of engagement from deeply personal to the disengaged. And in my video, Visiting the Holocaust Memorial by Proxy, I chose not to show imagery. I chose to reinterpret the interactions, the site itself, and my connection to it by way of translation through my body. So really description and gesture at the forefront. And here is a short clip of the video. I'm not sure that there is audio. So that was a short clip. The full video is 10 minutes long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Let me get set up for our next speaker really quickly, which, and again, keeping with the order of the exhibition or sections, will be Boz Garden for Resisting.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'll wait a second for the presentation to pop up. Here we go. Awesome. So also just want to thank really quick again, Jamie, for inviting me to talk today, and also want to thank Stephanie and Brianna for including me in the show. So my work in the show is called Riotous Folds, Possibilities for the Document. And if we go to the next slide, we can sort of think about this first set of images. And so this work came from a space primarily of frustration and exhaustion with this linguistic divide that was appearing around or in the wake of the riots and demonstrations happening earlier this year around May and June. And it was the divide between the peaceful protester, the destructive rioter, and the outside agitator. And this is something that I think we've seen throughout the histories of demonstrations and riots in the US. I think we saw this at the onset, or we did see this at the onset of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2012. And we saw this in 92 during the LA riots, right? And so something that I was completely uninterested in doing was romanticizing the peaceful protester and trying to redeem the so-called outside agitator and the so-called destructive rioter. Because I think that that's the sort of the work that the state wants us or me to perform, because it's really successful in fracturing the organizing work or the organizing efforts of those on the ground, and ultimately delegitimating the riot as an appropriate response to ongoing dispossession and death, right? So I wanted to bypass that sort of illusion completely and go right into thinking seriously or taking the riot seriously as a legitimate form or response to dispossession, right? So this brought me to first think about the problems in the ways that the riot is narrated in the terms set forth by the state. And what I think the state, does, right, is pose the riot in purely destructive terms, in turning to property destruction as the so-called true aftermath of the riot. And right, this is again also successful or effective in their favor, because what it does is says that the riot is only interested in leaving destruction in its wake and nothing else, which is the opposite of the work or the goals of abolitionism, right? That are as committed to unmaking as it is to imagining and generating something different. And so this is one of the first places I want to think about multiplicity as a keyword. Multiplicity maybe is a different word or a productive word than property destruction, because I think what's happening in the act of property destruction or vandalism is a sort of articulation or critique of space that says that what's happening now or how everything is arranged currently is unlivable and way too overdetermined by things like surveillance, policing, and prison, right? And so what I wanted to do was focus on shattered glass as one of the narrative motifs that the state returns to in turning the public away from the true projects of, the organizers demonstrating in the streets, right? And I wanted to think about, where does this fear of glass, or the image of shattered glass, come from beyond the immediate sort of threats to the property itself in that moment and the resources it's withholding from the public? I wanted to think about, what are the deeper sort of attachments that the public has to this image or presence of glass as an architectural aesthetic and tool. So in the next set of slides, we can look at this new set of images. And so what this brought me to was to think about the history of glass more broadly. And so I'm going to do like a sweeping sort of take or overview. So right, we saw the introduction of plate glass in the late 1800s, and it's sort of trickling into the early 20th century in the introduction of the, I guess, the window display as a sort of tool for commerce, which is its own sort of political space too. But I want to fast forward to the its post-war resurgence, when the first, towers or buildings using all glass facades are being constructed. And so all the way on the right here is one of the first buildings, which is the UN building that was built in 1948. And I think that's really important. That was important for me to think about in the process, because the UN building being this sort of symbol of a global unification, using glass as its sort of design aesthetic, I think comes to set forward or put in motion the terms for how the American public is going to think about glass at the symbolic level in the decades to come. So the other work so everything to the left, or to the right rather, is the work of Cesar Pelli, who was an architect in LA around the 60s and the 80s. And he was really intimate with the art scene unfolding here. And particularly he was taken up with the minimalist works being made. And of course, he was really interested in the glass cube. There's like a sculptural object that was being is a sort of popular approach. And he was really interested in the way that it, right, can collapse the sort of inside-outside boundaries or barriers and the background and the foreground. And I also don't want to think about Caesar as the person who introduces this into the field of architectural practices, but more so, right, he's symptomatic of a much broader shift in approaches and practices. And in that, I think that, you know, the architectural world leaning towards this idea of glass as this tool to collapse inside and outside is also symptomatic of this much broader national turn, because Cesar Pelli is also doing this work. He's constructing corporate towers as well as like civic and municipal buildings all across LA and like, across the United States at the neoliberal turn, right? And so as the United States is collapsing, you know, these imaginary borders through foreign policy, through manipulative foreign policy and economic policy, there is also this rise in this aesthetic or this desire to construct the built environment around this idea of blending and dissolving the inside and the barrier between the inside and the outside, right? And so, right, so this sort of manipulation, this illusion is of collapsing the world into sort of a unified global project is seen as progressive, right? And as a way of securing the United States' place into the future. And so, right, I'm thinking about that broader national project being upheld symbolically by glass and its uses or its effects as a sort of facade for these buildings, right? And so I think we see this in the way that, right, corporate towers and also buildings where political leaders might meet, or these places where power is concentrated are often within glass towers, right? And so I'm thinking about this as being where the fear and anger that the image of shattered glass comes from, right? Because it's not just the fear of what's happening to the building and its resources. It's also the fear of what it's going to do or what it spells out for the future of the American project and our so-called exceptionalism. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at the first work. So what I wanted to do with these two images is, right, really think with glass as the primary material to sort of start off with, and learning from, you know, those on the ground who are using these panes of glass as spaces or fields to articulate these like unsayable, you know, political demands. I wanted to sort of use that as a field or plane where I'm also working out these different relationships between archival documents and objects. And so what I'm thinking about these is as a sort of queered still life or still lives, because I'm thinking about the normative still life as, right, a sort of huddling of objects leaning upon one another or responding to gravity in these different ways. Whereas in these, there are places or moments where how the document or the object is being held is unclear. And so thinking about that refusal of gravity, or this sort of thinking about it as like a suspension, as a way of looping back to this idea of multiplicity, that these objects are open or subject to shifts in meaning and relationships as time goes on, right? So if we go to the next one, we can look at this one, right? And so, so looping it back to multiplicity, right? I'm thinking about that as an approach to bring to the field of archival studies and archival research, that we need to sort of bring it not only in the way that we curate or the way that we relate one document or object to another, but we also need to crack open the narrative terms that it sort of exists within, especially, you know, archival documents about the histories of struggle and resistance, because they're often narrated in anti-Black terms, right? So we need to sort of go back and open that up and break free from this sort of the so-called fidelity of the archive, right? That sometimes there are misdirections that the state has placed there so as to secure certain kinds of futures that disallow certain subjects from living or being remembered, right? So in that way, I'm thinking about multiplicity as a sort of central tenet for abolitionism, or right, or learning as like an approach, as an abolitionist approach to, not only archival looking, but also for the history of how we arrange or relate ourselves in space. And so with that, I'll leave you on this final note of this line of the opaque multiplicity as the grammar of the riot and as that which makes liberation possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boz. And as I get set up with the next presentation, that will be Sasha, whose work is featured in the rewiring section of the exhibition.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Jamie, for organizing this, and thanks to Boz and Rachel who've spoken, and William who's speaking next. This is really nice to be part of. Now I'm thinking about normative still lives, which I think you're about to see a lot of. But actually that sort of brings some nice wording in some way actually to this project in some sense. So I'm going to keep thinking with normative still lives actually. So you'll pardon me, I'm going to be sort of reading from some text just to keep myself on track. So let me make sure I have it up. Okay, so what's on screen right now is an image from the exhibition, which is part of a larger project I've titled On the Subject of Tests, which concerns itself with the history of intelligence tests and their material attributes. What I'm trying to do is make an earnest effort to unpack the historical and aesthetic aspects of these tests, keeping in mind both my critique and intrigue in the objects. I found this presentation challenging to put together, since what I submitted to Archive Machines is a selection of 3 images from what's become a very large and complicated archive. So I'll try to briefly situate the overall project first. I'm thinking of this project, especially in regards to this stage, as a research project. So in that the images in the database, which I'll show you in a second, are not the result of research per se, but are instead made during the act of research. So they contribute to it, or they themselves are sort of the research. So I've ended up referring back to these images and objects pictured therein over and over through this project. So this image pictures the second iteration of the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale, which was published in 1960. This is an intelligence test kit used to determine IQ in children and adults in a variety of settings, including classrooms, therapist offices, and courts of law. The test is in a very complex lineage, having first been invented by Alfred Binet, this one at least, a French psychologist, and then this one was adapted by Louis Terman in the United States at Stanford at the turn of the century. So you're seeing the second iteration of the Stanford Binet. So I'll move to the next slide, and I'm going to move through some of these a little bit quickly. So this is an image of another test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is entered into the database. So this is an image, a screenshot from the database. The database has fields for my ongoing research information, including affiliated instructions, notes, and historical data. We can move to the next slide. This shows the insides of the same test. And then the next slide, this one's in the exhibition and shows the block design test. So this is one of the subtests within the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So I'll pause on this image and just sort of backtrack to kind of give a little bit more background on what you're, what's up on the screen. The project began for me with an early childhood interaction with these tests. So my mom was training for her PhD in psychology, and she'd bring these objects home. And I became really fascinated with them. They really stuck with me. I loved the little boxes, the toys inside. I was infatuated with the idea that these objects were sort of specially selected to test for intelligence. So I kind of held this fantasy that they were special in some way, and that they could see inside or know something about the test subject. So as I said before, these tests are used in educational and therapeutic settings. They're also used as aids in job recruitment and restructuring. And then much more troubling iterations were used in the military to determine rank, and at Ellis Island to assess those wishing to enter the United States. So you can probably grasp from this alone the embedded complexities within these tests, both in their aims and their uses. So they've been widely critiqued in regards to racial biases found in the tests, but they've also been defended for their use within educational settings when administered as a tool in determining specific different learning abilities. So I really started this project thinking mostly about the production of subject that happens within the testing encounter. So when someone's one-on-one with an examiner, I was most interested in the moment of testing. So rather than looking at the outcome regarding what the test sees, I wanted to know more about the outcome within the subject. What happens to them? How do they feel? What do they think? Does the test rub off on them? What do they remember of the test later? Do the objects and images make a change somehow within the person? The issue there, though, is that I'm not a social scientist and I didn't feel like I had the tools to do this research. The other issue I found with this inquiry is that I didn't want to produce a subjective study in some way. I didn't want to set up interviews and reproduce the test in any way. And so with the sort of skill sets and capabilities I had, I sort of decided to reframe at least this iteration of the project. So the first major part of this project is twofold. I wanted to collect and photograph a selection of tests. I've shown 2 of about 7, or no, more than that now, like 12 tests that I've been photographing. So I wanted to photograph them to really see what's inside of them and kind of in some way have them to study. So really have these images to refer back to again and again. And then the other thing I knew I needed to do was study their histories and sort of contextualize both their imagery and objects, but also how they were produced. So we can go to the next slide. I'll just leave this one up so that there's something else to rest your eyes on. So it was with the latter part of the project that I learned more about the test's historical roots. Looking back, to be honest, it was pretty naive that I didn't connect the dots. I knew at the start of the project about testing biases, and through really preliminary research through very preliminary research, there were already indications of really troubling attributes to the test, particularly, for example, that the state of California has banned the use on the most prevalent intelligence test to be used on Black children in the state due to what was deemed in court as biases written into the tests. But I didn't know a lot about the roots of intelligence testing. So I don't want to take up too much time here, so I'm not going to be able to give sort of a more complete genealogy. But I can say that the tests were deeply influenced by English and American eugenics movements. They were embroiled in attempts to make proof of hereditary intelligence, which begins to build statistical bases for what have been deemed like the race sciences, which are sort of an attempt at ratifying racial superiority through, supposed science. Simplified versions of the tests, for example, were, again, as I said, used at Ellis Island to determine who would be allowed to immigrate into the United States. But they were also used to produce out of that massive data sets that rank different ethnic and national groups who aim to enter the country. So, it sort of did a twofold damage, a personal one and this kind of statistical one. So what I want to work through in this project is multifold, complicated, hard to hold together. But basically, I want to think about the test objects themselves as archives of their histories, which tie together, for example, eugenics, but with childhood studies, education, disability studies, and workplace optimization. So what I've done thus far is begin to try and write down this genealogy, and then further in taking the material cultures of the objects seriously, I've built this database to archive the images. And I've taken these, I've built this database to archive the image I've taken of the test, which is both meant to hold the images themselves, as well as work on the textual information such as instructions, dates, creators, and then sort of my own associative notes, etc. I don't have a conclusion yet from this work, except to say that it feels important to unearth this history yet again and investigate it, to look at how these seemingly innocuous objects hold dangerous and damaging histories. Right now, the images are meant to hold their own in some way, but I know that they also probably require this textual or verbal description. At the very least, I contend that by knowing something of this history, it changes what can be seen in the images. So I just will flip through kind of the next few. The next one, this is the case closed and then open. And then the next one is toys and objects from inside. So some of these are from the classroom, some from the asylum. Next slide. This is a printed booklet with a bell curve drawn on it, which is the mathematical sort of statistical process used to determine the IQ number. The next slide is a puzzle that shows a profile of a woman's face cut into pieces, but this one also closely resembles a wooden puzzle used for the same purposes at Ellis Island. And then finally, one more slide, a woman at the mirror putting on lipstick. I know it's quite hard to see in this, but the test subject is meant to deduce that the image in the mirror isn't mirroring the action of the woman. Anyway, so I'm still thinking of this information that I know about the test and what that information ultimately does to what I see. So I'll leave it there with probably more questions hanging in the air than when I started. But I hope that this at least acted as some kind of introduction to how I've started the project. So thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. And last but not least, we have William Camargo. And let me just get that presentation set up really quickly.
Well, thanks for everyone that's able to stay and listen to these amazing artists as well. So just, this is me, William Camargo. We can go to the next slide. And I just like to always start with kind of a lot of the influence that I make my work from, and it starts from a personal perspective and a lived experience, which is my lived experience living in Anaheim, California. And this is a VHS collection for my home movies, which is my birthday party, and then a snippet of my cousin in the same party. Next one. And then I always, as someone who was living away for a while, I was always interested in trying to figure out the stories and the archives that were not really being shown to myself, to my family, and it kind of erased this narrative that wasn't really front and centered and what was happening with with issues in my city. So this is kind of like archive that I found of a Mexican school in Anaheim. Next one. And as I was making my work, a lot of the influential work that I was making just is everyday documentation of a city, in a city that I was, growing up in, and have a certain perspective to it. And I noticed that there was this disconnection between, what folks were talking about when they talked about the happiest place on earth, which was Disneyland, and the lived experiences that I personally went through living here. Next one. And then was my lived experience. It was a connection with, kind of street culture, and when I did come back, I was really seeing what, with the digital space and digital archives were popping up as a kind of rise in activism. Starting off with kind of like Veteranas y Rucas, going into these spaces as from a different perspective that usual archives are not meant to be. And again, we had control of these kind of stories, creating this kind of counter stories, counter archives of people. Next one. And from there, I figured out how to try to give a different perspective of that story and create an archive of my own, through looking at these other spaces. And this is kind of a depiction of a couple of neighborhoods in my hometown through gang signs, which was usually I was left out of the narrative of my own stories. Next one. And this one of the works that's in the show, realizing that there was this connection with kind of symbols and ways folks were looking at Black and brown folks in a city like mine, and generally in the United States. These kind of double temporality of symbols on a Black person and a brown person and a brown body. These are things I found on the internet. You can go to the next slide, please. I went to a website and I found these quote unquote prison tattoos that are used for Hollywood production films. And I realized that, that stereotype is still very prevalent in society and especially in Hollywood. That kept thinking back of how, my upbringing in a city was very kind of much connected to the prison industrial complex. Next one. And along with the city archives and the city narratives that were being told, these issues of gentrification really came forward. The constant erasure of a people in an archive made a connection with the displacement that was happening in a city, and how actually artists can play a role to that, especially with what was going on in Boyle Heights. There was this kind of double erasure and a double heightened invisibility that folks did feel. And on top of that, my personal kind of experience as an artist, trying to not be complicit in this, which this is a great article. If some of y'all haven't seen it or read it, I think it's a great way to kind of look back at yourself and see what we can do with this issue. Next one. And this, also wanted to respond to the archive and kind of intervene in what was happening. And this is one way that I managed to do that. And because in this work, I was looking at the archives, but I wanted to present them in a different way. I was still keeping that connection with my own lived experience in the city. Next one. And I was pairing them again with, there's also this issue that I always kind of come up with when I speak about an archive or an image of mine that I create. It's this invalidation that I get from folks that I need to also again, show this kind of proof, because lived experiences wasn't enough. And I think digging up these histories, always, get told that there's, that was 100 years ago, that was 40 years ago. And I try to really kind of connect these, contemporary happenings of social injustice to the archive, as a form to kind of think about how we can move forward and really kind of, begin to heal at least. Next one. And I'll go through some of these more quickly from that same project that is in the show. Along with that work, I'm always trying to also challenge the canon, or even deconstruct it, or erase it at least, because I think the canon is also a dangerous place to, in a violent way, to erase folks. Next one. And I think, the archive for me is something that really can create new stories, centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So, this is something that I always look at when I'm making my work, is how these archives can open up, these topics of race or violence in history, and, like really burn down the master's house with them too. The next one. We'll go to the next one. And with this particular image, one of the most common comments I got on Instagram, or whichever space was showing it, was I was the insertion that white woman worked in the space too. And again, it went around again with this kind of invalidation of lived experiences by Black, brown women in spaces like these. It's certainly coming from an institutional perspective, because I always thought, right, who validates knowledge in institutions were always mostly white male figures. Next one. And again, I was having to, show an image like this to quote unquote prove that this was true. Next one. And I think one thing with, we can go back, I really like how to think about my work as a cooperation with community, in different ways of how I imagine an archive, and how archives are being collected is way different than the way I do it as a community archivist. There needs to be this kind of mutual agreement with community members, not just taking in and kind of dishing out the archives to to whoever views them in institutions, but how we can also create this accessibility for folks to look at the archive, and give them some power to control how the archive is shown as well. The way I work is I don't own any of these archives. The archive is owned by the community that is allowing me to show this work. Next one. And a lot of the work I do create is from lived experiences, which is a very intersectional way of making work, and always challenging the canon with that as well, to create these counter stories. And this particular project got me in a fight with the maker of this quote unquote original work, John DeVola. Next one. And the other, this is one of the works also in the show, is this kind of praxis that I've been creating, and is really kind of Chicano sensibility that is quote unquote called the rascachismo, which is really making do with what you got. And I think all of us have a living archive, and my living archive is those objects that are around me, from my own home, from my own community. And I think it's a way of working that is very resourceful to our communities. And I think sometimes makes it a lot more relatable as well. I can just imagine if all these artists in the show would kind of copy a work like this, it would be so amazing to see the different objects that we carry, that we hold dear to ourselves as well. Next one. And I always kind of try to connect the work that I do to things I've read, and I think that's what this rascachismo kind of aesthetic is. It's an underdog perspective. Its attitude is rooted in resourcefulness and adaptability, but still, mindful of stance and style. And I think I'll leave it off to that.
Great, thanks so much, William. Let me just get out the presentation really quickly. Great, well, that concludes the artist presentation section, and we do have, we did leave about 10 minutes for Q&A, so if you do have questions, which there are a few questions that I will read out, and if anybody else thinks of any questions, feel free to either enter them in the chat, or if you would prefer to take yourself off mute and ask them yourself, you're more than welcome to do that. The first question I see here is for Boz. What criteria are to be defined to identify legitimate riots from non-legitimate riots, given that almost every riot can be argued to be an expression of grievances?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's important to make a distinction in, especially I think today, because I think there is a Proud Boy rally unfolding in DC, perhaps as we speak. So, right, so this sort of question of like, what is a legitimate riot or what is a illegitimate one? Or at least maybe thinking about which ones should we pay attention to, I guess, is maybe if I'm interpreting that correctly. I guess to be explicit about it, right? I think that the riots that are interested in or have a relationship to a project for a white ethno-state or white nationalism, or riots that are interested in maintaining these dispossessive structures of the state, like surveillance policing and prisons. Those riots, I guess, are ones to think about, but I am more interested in, because those riots still have a power over these other riots that are being de-archived or unarchived, or whose stories are being manipulated in the terms by which they're told. So I don't know if that gets at the question, but right, yeah, I think that the work that at least I'm more interested in is the work of narrating the riots that are committed to a project of multiplicity and abolitionism, and less the ones that are committed to maintaining the certain orders of oppression and death making and death dealing.
Thank you, Boz. And just go again, just reading out the questions as I see them. This next question is for you, Sasha. Given that there are significant levels of varieties of bias in intelligent tests, including racial bias, One sensible remedy is to take steps to minimize or entirely remove the identifiable biases. What have critics of intelligence tests proposed to minimize the biases, especially the racial biases? What's been their substantive contributions to remedy the situation?
So I'd say that there's a sort of a scale of interest that sort of maybe follow the reform abolish kind of discourse. So there are certainly attempts to reform the tests, and that's been happening since the first couple of iterations of the tests. New questions, a number of specialists were brought in. You know, my feeling is that it's in the test and you can't take it out. It's just in there. It's built into how these tests are made, and there's no way to remove it. To sort of speak simply, particularly because of sort of the history of the kinds of things that have come out of the test, what they've actually materially done to individuals, to larger groups of people. So you know, very simply, there's been work to reform them, but I don't think it's substantial enough, and I don't think it's going to change. And probably, you know, I should have been clear in a lot of ways in my presentation about my own sort of personal standpoint on these tests, but I just don't think that there's a way to sort of pull their histories out of them. And that's just sort of simply it, that the entire notion of a measurable IQ or hereditary IQ is problematic. And that's it. But
Okay, and then I think there's a follow-up question for you, Sasha, about that. What's your evidence for the claim that the biases in the tests are irremovable?
I mean, I'm not a social scientist or a psychologist, so evidence doesn't sort of work in that kind of evidentiary way. It's such a long, complicated history that it's sort of, I don't want to take up too much time when we have a couple of minutes left. But again, I think that there are sort of material reflections in regards to funding for particular kinds of education programs, funding being stripped from schools with low testing, problems with college admissions and SAT tests, for example. That kind of standardized testing is built directly out of this kind of the test form that sort of originated with the intelligence test. So there's sort of so much that I don't really know how to evidence it, except to say that I don't think measuring people's worth by how they do on a multiple choice test is enough. So I'll just simply say that.
Thank you, Sasha. Sorry, let me scroll back up. The next question is for all four artists. Are any of you concerned about the way your work is exhibited, such as via public art, galleries, or museums? Does anybody want to?
I'll start.
Thanks, Boz.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is a important question to consider, because I think that, you know, we've seen over, you know, the past couple of years, right, in certain institutions or galleries or museums, and their intimacies to the violence of the United States, whether that's through military prisons or anything, you know, in between or akin to that. And so I think that it's definitely important to think about, since all of our work, you know, here and most of the work in the show is trying to critique and unmake and challenge these canons and these systems that, you know, they exist or are shown in a context that, at least for me, I think that it's important that this work exists in a space where those questions are being considered by those running that space, right? So that the ones in power are with me, because I don't want to just show the work to show the work. I'm interested in showing the work collaboratively with that space. So I don't know if that answers that question, but yeah.
I mean, to add that, I think for me, it's about also how accessible these spaces are, specific to communities that I do work with, and how we can also give them the benefit of that they can also create some programming around the work and have conversations that, specifically with some work that I have in a local museum in Anaheim. A lot of the comments I've been getting is that, they've never even been to the museum. It's, I think, $15-20 to get in. And they never just knew it was a museum in general. So I think that's something that's always my concern of how accessible these spaces can be.
I think we all share, definitely, as Boz mentioned, a critical eye towards these sort of institutional structures. And I think the way that I view it is that if going in and taking a look at archival approaches, that the type of work I hope to do would be to challenge those structures and then perhaps bring other voices or other ways of creating those systems of power in.
Thank you. And the next question I see, and we'll just, let me see. Okay. Yes, the next question I see here is for Rachel. Rachel, I wonder if you can comment about the connection between the archive and the body and the ways in which the body can embody memory of collective and individual traumas. And there's a comment that says, "Thank you for sharing your work."
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the archive and the body are in opposition to each other through the interest in preservation and keeping preservation and static qualities. And I guess I'm interested in the ways that sites of and collective memory can be interpreted in multiple and fluctuating ways. So there is this sort of dependency on the body and the archive, and it's something that I want to continue chipping away at.
Thank you, Rachel. I actually have a few last questions for the artists, unless anybody else has any questions. But I have for you, William. I'm wondering, can you just define for us how you define community archiving and how it approached or how it differed from the found archives that you also have used in your work?
Yeah, I mean, the found archives are, it took me a while to even look, find them actually. Navigating through, again, institutions, and I'm in a position that I do have 2 degrees, and I think I was thinking about how I was able to access those versus the way my own community doesn't have access to those same resources that I do. And I think the community archiving aspect is, I center it with mutual aid as well. I just don't want to, take people's photographs and then, show them, but I also want to see what kind of resources these communities do need and how we can kind of have, create this mutual agreement and centered in cooperation as well. Before the pandemic, I was starting to organize these kind of, community centered spaces where folks would meet up with me, and we would have conversation and do some kind of more like social practice work with the community. And then if they wanted me to scan some of their work, the family photographs, we would do that. Again, not belonging to me, I don't take the physical photographs unless they do give them to myself. And then, there's the whole problem with, I know Guadalupe Rosales of Veteranas Irukas has been approached about, having her archive housed in an institution. And, I think a lot of us are probably a little skeptical about that, giving up archives to an institution, because we still want the community to kind of have control of that and access as well.
Thank you. One last question for all four of the artists. How do you feel your work intersects with the other frameworks of the section? So whether it's intersects with resisting or rewiring and or relating and or revisioning, and then just I'm wondering too, just now that the exhibition and all sections are fully available and have been fully available, what new takeaways have you as artists gotten from with respect to just seeing all four sections together?
So I think that to answer the second question first, I think that's something that, seeing as the rest of the work has unfolded or has become accessible, that I've been really thinking about fabulation or poesis as a sort of the second half or the follow-up to like archival research, right? Because there's always something missing in the story or in the document. And so the approach that we have to take as people looking through these materials is fill in the gaps. That's a poor way of wording it, but in the sort of critical way of trying to imagine the world that these objects and materials exist within, and also what's missing. So I think that that's been something I've been thinking about as more of the work has come out, is that, art making, especially about the archive, is sort of this, I don't know, I'm seeing this more and more as a intrinsic sort of relationship and sort of imagining what is not there and how to approach that absence. But I think, the work that I have in the show is related, I think, in many ways to revisioning and relating, in the way that it's putting forward, suggestions or demands, depending on how intimate you are with abolitionism, about how to relate to space and how to relate to documents and how to relate documents to other documents, and revisioning in the way that is, the act of going back to those documents and giving them different narrations that aren't overdetermined by the state and its various forms of power. So that's me.
I think I could say that I definitely feel a kinship with many of the works in each of the sections, and just the way that so many of the participating artists have looked at data, records, sort of information that's deeply impersonal and made them personal, and just really excited by the overlap and interest in photography and also mapping systems.
Yeah, I think what Boz is saying about sort of the missing pieces of the archive is really valuable, because I think that there's this sort of fantasy, and I have this fantasy of like the archive being able to hold it all, some way to sort of infuse all of the information and everything that's necessary. And there's never room for that. And the things that slip out, depending on the sort of archive, but there's always something that slips out, and it's always really hard to hold everything. And I think, I felt really excited to see the works that I saw today. I mean, I'd seen all of your works before in the show, but sort of see them a little bit more intimately because of the sort of interventions that you've all made, and sort of, quite literally with Rachel's work showing the cracks in sort of archiving the cracks, the what's missing or what's falling apart or what's being lost. So yeah, I think the way that sort of has undermined this idea of the comprehensive kind of quality of an archive is interesting. And I think in terms of the categories or sort of areas of the exhibition, maybe similarly, I think the slippages between those is really interesting too. And it was nice to sort of see them emerge one by one, but then be able to sort of recontextualize work amongst the sort of other areas. I don't know where mine would go. It's 10 p.m. here. I just, but that's all I can sort of pull together.
Yeah, for me, it's like this, it's beautiful to see how all of us are trying to answer all these questions and our ways of kind of thinking. And sometimes we won't get those answers with this work, but I think we can all kind of make these interconnections with, our own communities or the work that we've been making with the show. And I think it's a nice connection to see other folks thinking about all these things that sometimes I feel like I'm alone at in some situations. But it's really nice to see that, we're going to these interpersonal struggles as well. And it's been super nice to see that. When one of them dropped, I was like, oh yeah, this is so amazing. Especially, I saw Feliz Quintana's work and I saw the huge connection that I have with his work, and how we kind of have conversations with each other, despite not being in the gallery, but through the digital spaces. It was super beautiful.
Thank you. I think that's really great point to end on. On behalf of the gallery, thank you all so much for being here. Massive thanks to Rachel, Boz, Sasha, and William for just sharing more information about your work. And again, to everyone who joined us today. And I also want to give a special thank you to the Department on Disability, in particular, Richard Ray, and our program sign language interpreters, Hillary and Nicole. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to Stephanie and to Brianna for organizing this really fantastic exhibition. And again, congratulations to all the artists who were part of our very first online only show. And that concludes our last program for Archive Machines and for 2020. If you haven't seen the show, please make sure you check it out. It's only going to be on view at lamag.org through December 31st. Thank you all so much. And with that, we'll end here. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.